مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. إنها تلقي بظلالها الكثير من قضايا السياسات. لماذا شكل ظهور الغاز الصخري كمصدر رئيسي للطاقة محركا أساسيا للقوى أمريكا الاقتصادية؟ لماذا كانت هجة قوية استخدامها الرئيس ترامب ضد هيلاري كلينتون تجاهلها لأشخاص والثقافة في قطاع صناعة الفحم؟ وما المكون الأساسي في قوة أو ضعف حلفاء أمريكا العرب سعر برميل النفط؟ ماذا ينتقد الرئيس ترامب في اتفاق باريس حول الاقتصاد كيؤوده حول استخدام الطاقة؟ ماذا كان يغذي التعاون الغير مسبوق بين العرب والإسرائيليين في منطقة البحر المتوسط التجارة في الغاز الطبيعي؟ الطاقة 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 لا نراها ولكنها موجودة في كل مكان ويمكن أن تسيطر على شؤوننا السياسية وتحدد استراتيجياتنا للأمن القومي. لمناقشة الجوانب السياسية للطاقة وسياساتها وخاصة في علاقات الولايات المتحدة مع الشرق الأوسط، يسرني أن أرحب بخبيرين متميزين وهما سايمون هندرسون وإيما أشفورد. Welcome back to Dakhel Washington. Today, our topic is energy and policy here in the United States. And I'm delighted to welcome two experts on energy, American politics, and foreign policy, Emma Ashford and Simon Henderson. Welcome to our show. So Simon, let's begin with you. There was a time when America was hostage to energy producers around the world, not all of whom were friends and allies. But what's the situation today with America energy and production?
Hostage is an emotive word and possibly applied at one time. It was certainly the public perception and certainly the political perception. Economically, it was never quite that case. At the moment, though, everything has rather changed and it is continuing to change. And this is really for a couple of reasons. One is the tremendous increase in US energy production, particularly what is known as shale oil and shale gas, and also a changing environment in the world, which means that although energy demand is going up, there's a lot of oil and gas still to be found out there, plus other ways of producing energy, plus greater efficiencies in the way that that energy is being produced.
So when you put it all together, Emma, how does this dramatic shift change America's strategic position?
Well, what's interesting is we're seeing these fairly dramatic changes in the global oil market. We're seeing production shift from the traditional oil-producing countries, often poorer, often in other regions, and it's shifting back towards richer, more Western countries like the US. But US strategic planning doesn't really seem to have caught up to that yet. We're only just starting to have the debates about whether the US should continue to be as heavily invested in the Middle East, whether we should continue to be protecting the sea lanes that transport this oil. So even as countries in the Middle East start to think about shifting towards Asia, the US is still acting as if it's looking for Middle Eastern oil.
And Simon, how do you see this dramatic change affecting America's strategic position?
Well, I would have to say that I think I probably disagree with Emma on that point. The nature of oil, indeed the problem of oil, and indeed, the marvelous quality of oil, is that it is transportable anywhere in the world. And so there is a world oil price. There are slight adjustments in that price, but here and there, but essentially it's one price. This means that the United States cannot cut itself off from thinking about the rest of the world, even though its own energy production, oil and gas, has improved and continues to improve. So in political terms, if the United States cares about its political leadership in the world and its economic leadership in the world and its desire to have a prosperous world economy, frankly, it has to continue to be the world's policeman. It cannot walk away from the Middle East.
And Emma, you see this debate just beginning to emerge, is that right?
I think so. I do think, I agree with Simon to some extent that, the US can't completely walk away from it and we can't completely stop worrying about global oil prices. But the fact is we are far less vulnerable to shifts in the oil market than we were 30, 40 years ago. Something like the 1973 oil embargo simply couldn't happen today. It might impact us on price, but it wouldn't impact the actual supply of oil coming into the US. We would simply find substitutes at a slightly higher price. And so the question is not whether the US abdicates all responsibility for dealing with the global oil market, it's whether we need to be so heavily invested, particularly whether we need to have tens of thousands of troops in the Middle East, whether we need to have major naval bases in Bahrain. And I think this is a strategic debate that we are going to see emerging in DC over the next 5 to 10 years.
All right, let me come back to the international set of questions in a moment. I wanted to just explain to our viewers a little bit about what this evolution or perhaps revolution is doing domestically. Simon, shale, you referred to this earlier. What impact is this shale revolution having more broadly in the American economy and American access to energy?
Well, it means, there's both shale oil and shale gas, that there's a lot more domestic energy available, and essentially it's cheap. This is having an effect on world oil and world gas prices, and so it's maintaining a comparatively low figure that we have for those things at the moment. Now, if you're Saudi Arabia, low oil price is bad news. Government revenues fall. If you're the United States, low oil price or low gas price is essentially good news. It's sort of upsetting if you're an oil company or a gas company, and it might upset your shareholders, but low energy prices are good for the consumer in the United States and good for the US economy, because it means that energy prices, that part of the production costs, are kept low.
Emma, the phrase energy independence, is it a reasonable objective? Are we close? Does it matter?
No, there is not going to ever be such a thing as a completely energy independent United States, and I'm not sure we would want it even if we could achieve it. Even when we're talking about the growth of shale oil and shale gas, a substantial portion of that is coming in from Canada or from Mexico. It's not just here in the US. But what we have done, I would say, is reduce our vulnerability and reduced it to a level where US producers now have much more impact on global oil prices. OPEC's influence on the global oil market is far less than it was even 5 years ago.
So, Simon, do you agree on this, that energy independence is a bit of a term that we should put aside?
I deplore the term energy independence. The far more valid term for this sort of discussion is energy security, which really means options. We have options in the United States. We're very lucky in that respect. If we were Japan, which has no oil and gas whatsoever, their anxiety about energy security is much more concerning for them. But here in the United States, we have domestic supplies and a wide range of domestic supplies, whether it be oil, gas, coal, and a huge amount of what's known as renewables, wind, solar, the rest of it. And so that's great news, combined with having friendly neighbors, Canada to the north and Mexico to the south, which are also rich in energy. We've got a lot of energy security, and energy security has improved.
Or at least neighbors that historically have been friendly. We need to keep it that way.
We need to keep it that way, but frankly, the economic imperative for these countries to want to be part of the one economy with the United States, which they essentially are, despite the noises which are sometimes made by politicians, we're fine.
Simon mentioned in passing the word renewable. Lots of focus on the concept of renewables and the potential of renewables. But here in the United States, are we approaching a breakout in terms of the use of renewables, or has the shale revolution just kicked that down the road decades? Emma?
You know, I think I want to go back to this idea that Simon mentioned about options. And I think renewables are never going to be the majority of how we produce our energy, but they are one option, and they're an increasingly economically viable option. In fact, renewables are beginning to sort of pool level with coal in terms of how cheap they are for use as energy. And so renewables are one option, shale oil and gas is another, importing more traditional sources of hydrocarbon is another. And the more that we can build up all of these options, and the more that we can learn how to conserve energy effectively, that's what will lead eventually to energy security. It's not about focusing solely on any one path to energy security.
And do you accept this basic argument that I think you used the word never? Never is a very long period of time. Is never when we'll be relying principally on renewables?
Who knows? You know, if you wind the clock back 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, and would have attempted to have this discussion, it would have been a totally different discussion. Things have happened. There have been new discoveries, there have been new technology. What was absurdly expensive technology 10 or 20 years ago is now cheap. And there's another ingredient as well, which is public preference. People don't want to be warming the planet. They now find that they can do their own bit about not warming the planet by having solar panels on the roof of their house, or signing up with their electric company so that the electricity supplied to them is generated by wind and things like this. So there is a public ingredient in this, not only in the United States, but also, broadly speaking, the other Western type democracies, which is having an enormous impact on energy demand and indeed energy preferences.
Okay, when we come back, we're going to shift our conversation from the use and policy related to energy here in the United States to the international implications of all this change in the energy world in just a moment. Again, our panelists include Emma Ashford. Emma is a research fellow at the Cato Institute, a prominent think tank here in Washington, focusing on politics and foreign policies of oil exporting countries. An expert on sanctions and their impact on international business, her doctoral dissertation from the University of Virginia explored ways in which the oil industry shapes conflict, including wars in Ukraine, Yemen, and Syria. Emma's work has appeared in some of the most important media outlets in America, from Foreign Affairs to the New York Times. Sitting to her left is Simon Henderson, the Baker Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, where he directs the Gulf and Energy Policy Program, one of the world's leading experts on the strategy, politics, and economics of Middle East energy. Simon previously spent 20 years as a journalist with the venerable Financial Times of London. So earlier, Simon referred to this paradox that low energy prices are good for us, but maybe bad for our allies. Let's take a look at this, Emma. Let's take a look specifically at some of the countries you focus on. We're in a bout of low energy prices right now. How is that affecting some of America's allies around the world?
Well, particularly in the Middle East, we're seeing a lot of petro-exporting states starting to experience budgetary problems. Just in the last few years, we have seen states that are less friendly to the US, like Venezuela, suffer such serious budgetary problems that the state appears to be nearing collapse, perhaps. And among America's friends and allies in the Middle East, we have seen almost every state, particularly even Saudi Arabia, start to institute various policies designed to try and bolster their budget in an era of low oil prices and continuing low oil prices. And I think the most interesting program here really is the Saudi Vision 2030 program, which in the Saudi state is going to try and wean itself off of being so dependent on resource revenues in the future. Whether or not they succeed with that, I think, is going to be one of the more interesting questions for Middle Eastern stability.
So, Simon, A, do you think they're going to succeed? But B, how do we partner with a big country on Saudi Arabia, we the United States, partner with a big country like Saudi Arabia when our interests on such a fundamental issue as the price of energy are so diametrically opposed?
Well, diametrically opposed is a loaded term. Traditionally, the United States has wanted Saudi Arabia to be a reliable supplier of oil, and Saudi Arabia has claimed publicly that they will be a reliable supplier of oil. There used to be a part of this saying which was at a reasonable price. In recent years, the price has gone all over the place. And we certainly didn't think it was a good idea when it went over $100. The Saudis at that point turned around to us and sort of said, well, that's the price it's worth. Well, lo and behold, fast forward a couple of years to today, and it's $50 or so, and sort of weak, so it's below $50 per barrel, and the Saudis are unhappy. They're unhappy because they've built an economy which was reliant on high prices, and they're now having to adjust that economy. For all its faults, and there are faults, Saudi Arabia considers the United States to be its friend, and it's useful for us, for Saudi Arabia to be our ally, or one of our allies in the Middle East. So we have to help them to adjust to this changing circumstance. Saudi Arabia, a very conservative country, often hasn't done adjustment very well. They now have a project called Vision 2030, which is their attempt, apparently, to try and shift their economy away from its dependence on oil and broaden the nature of the economy so that it has its own industry, so that the Saudi citizenry have a greater role in the workforce. But this is a bit of a struggle. It's also a logical challenge because in order to finance this, they want to sell off part of their state-owned oil company known as Saudi Aramco. They want to sell it to foreign investors. Will foreign investors want to buy something, a chunk of something which the Saudis are also saying isn't going to be such an important part of their economy? There are many questions to Vision 2030, and my basic judgment on it is actually we should be talking about Vision 2035 rather than 30, and it may actually be Vision 2040.
Okay, very good. But now you mentioned earlier Venezuela, and the bigger point is it's not just allies who are in trouble with low oil, it's some of our adversaries too. And I wanted to ask you specifically, Emma, about Russia, a country you know something about. It might be bad for Saudi Arabia, but it's even worse, I would assume, for a country like Russia, which relies so heavily on energy exports. Is this the one of the upsides in foreign relations from low oil prices?
I think one of the interesting factors here is that it doesn't really matter how dependent a country is on oil. What's determining whether they're having a really bad time today is whether they planned for this when oil prices were high. So the countries that have struggled the most are the ones who assumed when writing their budgets that oil would remain above $100 a barrel forever. And so if you look at a country like Venezuela, they assumed that oil prices would be $120 or even $130 a barrel. And today they're having to deal with a budget where oil prices are about $50 a barrel. The Russians were more sensible. And so the Russian budget assumed that oil prices would be somewhere in the $80 to $100 range. But they have been very hard hit by this sort of recession in the price of oil. And that has been worsened by the impact of US sanctions. Mostly they found it harder to borrow on international markets. The impact has really fallen most heavily, though, not on the Russian government, but on the Russian people. And I would question whether that ends up being a good thing for US foreign policy. Surely, if these governments are unpleasant, we want the government itself to struggle in an era of low oil prices. Instead, what we see in Russia is that it's mostly ordinary people that are seeing massive inflation on food prices, housing prices. They're seeing their wages stagnate or even fall, and that's not good from a human rights standpoint.
Okay, fascinating. Thank you both very much, Simon Henderson, Emma Ashford, for joining us today on Dachel Washington. Behava nasilu il nehayat hadahil halka min barnamij Dachel Washington. Either Kenneth ladeikum eya istafsarat o ta'alikat haul hadahil halka, wa khasatan haul el elaka bain siyasat el taka wal aman el komi fi baledikum. Arju an turasaluni mubasharatan ala anwan el barid electroni itali inside Washington at elhura.com. Ma'akum Robert Satloff. Shukran lakum wa ila laka.